Good morning. So, what I'm talking about in this lecture is the following topics. Okay, as you can see on the screen, I will start off with the concept of connotation and the narrative and myth. As you can see, that we are now uh, discussing size in the broader context, in the uh, cultural context. Just to recap what we did earlier on narrative. And narrative is, we talk about narrative as being a story that, and also a figurative language where the relationship between sides are what we call multi direction. It's about our uh, ability to express our feelings, our emotion uh, through the use of uh, metaphors or signs. And this is the outline. I will talk a little bit about the definitions, size as cultural products. We can, as I told you a little bit, a little while earlier, that SI is in the cultural cultural products, and two meanings of the word myth, and I will position a myth in the context of narrative. Okay, and I will actually explain why we need to be able to uh, emancipate, I mean, free ourselves from the uh, I'm not from the conditions uh, imposed upon us by, I don't want to say society, but the uh, speech community. Yeah. So these are the outline. As I told you a while ago, that a size, even though we look at size as being size from nature, like the sunrise, the sunset, and the size as being writing, symbols, artifacts, objects created by man or human beings. But in general, when we talk about size in semiotics, we recognize that a size is a cultural thing. You can see the religious size on the left hand side. Okay, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, you know, Hinduism, and Sikh, I think, and this is Zen Buddhism, Shintoism, and others. So size are either man-made or cultural. Okay, but in semiotics, we, even though a size is cultural, is a product of nature, like the sunrise. We actually uh, make sense of the natural things, natural happenings based on our uh, cultural interpretation anyway. Now let's move on to the concept of connotation. In general, we often look at meanings from, broadly speaking, to meanings, to approaches. The first is the denotative meaning, which is direct. Mm, nice coffee. And we can say that a tiger is a mammal, for example. Um, yeah, a chicken is an animal, which is direct. So psi A equals psi B in semiotic term. In And then we have connotation or connotative meaning. Words has what we call associated meaning, appealing to our emotion, and what we call evaluation. Uh, for example, when you say that he is a Thai army general, the word Thai army general might be interpreted differently in different cultures, depending on your perhaps ideologies, cultural backgrounds. Uh, the word, for example, the word Rohingya might be perceived or might have different connotative meanings for the Myanmar people, the general Myanmar people. They may have different, you know, different perception of the Rohingya people than some other cultures, some other economies. Let me put it this way. So let's move on to a little bit of theory. So in semiotics, connotation happens or arises when the denotative relationship between a signifier and its signifier is inadequate. I mean, there are more things you want to communicate, to convey, but you don't really want. Sometimes it's not actually inadequate. Sometimes it has constraints. Communication is not free. Communication is a cultural activity. I mean, when you communicate, you are actually um, following or dealing with uh, laws, rules, regulation. For example, on the internet, you cannot just blah 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 what you want to blah blah blah. You don't. You have to follow rules, regulations, policies, guidelines, uh, and there are constraints. There are limitations. So another explanation is that we have limitations. Limitations. Sometimes we uh, create certain connotative meaning to communicate what is not possible to publicly articulate. Right. So connotation is about the relationship between signifier and its referent or signifier. Uh, Sometimes is inadequate because of uh, limitations, limitation, or because of conventions. We need to kind of expand the boundary of the what we call the semantic boundary. Semantic actually meaning semantic boundary. It's also something cultural. Earlier we talked about the arbitrariness between the signifiers and its signifier. I want to remind you that the principles that we discussed earlier, the four aspects of size, remain important. Uh, I mean, words or a set of size can have different connotations. The same event can be perceived or interpreted using different representations. Remember also that a sign or language is about representation. Okay. The same event or the same phenomenon can be represented differently. For example, it can be represented using the positive connotation like democracy lovers, or freedom lovers. Different narrative can actually in other for other cultural group they may refer to the same group of people as troublemakers, protesters, or a bunch of mobs. Uh, you can refer to a group of people as freedom fighters. This is quite positive connotation. And for other people, they may call it terrorists. Terrorists. This is quite negative. Okay. The thing that we have to understand that the language or the discourse actually construct the society. That's why we need to pay special attention to uh, the semiotic uh, construction of the meaning, because this is important to how we perceive the term, the meaning, the meaning of life, the what is good to be, what is acceptable, what is normal. Now, I just talk about connotation at the word level, but connotation can be visual. We have what we call visual connotation. Uh, you can look at the example here. You can see that the first thing that comes to your mind is, that's a door. It's a door. But another layer would say that, well, the connotation is, well, elegance, luxury. So connotation is in terms of visual, what we call sign, is functioning at the what we call the another layer. I would represent it this way. If you look at the diagram, you will see the two levels of signification. Side A, which is an icon. When you look at the icon, you will interpret it as being a door. That is the first level or layer. And then you have another layer from the same icon. You would actually associate the characteristic or the adjective of that side as being luxury or associate with elegance, beautiful, luxury. So this is what we mean by levels of signification from the visual um, side, the visual connotation. And this is how people carry meanings at the deeper level. As I just mentioned, the same event can be represented by different stories or the use of narratives, different narratives. Like you can actually classify or you can use different labels. Uh, you know, you can say that peace lover or democracy lover, the the earth lovers, and for people, other people, the different narrative may apply, like troublemakers, mobsters, something like that. And also remember also that discourses construct society, is frame our thinking, the our perspective of the world actually is in our being. So I would like to quote a French scholar by the name of Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes put it that narrative may be transmitted through oral written language, through static or moving images, through gestures, to an organized mixture of all these substances. So it can be, actually a narrative then is a collection of signs. And we have learned that a sign is anything representing something else. And so a narrative is a collection or a unit of cultural signs. Cultural sign. A cultural sign is a sign agreed upon by people in the same society. So it can be many things. So it can be a metaphor. It can be a book like this. It can be an object like this. Now let's move on to the meaning of the word myth. Well, what do we mean by we say a myth? A myth then is a form of narratives. Okay, there is narrative in myth. In order to have a myth, you need to have a story. So there is narrative in most of the things, like in myth, in legend, fables, fairy tales, novellas, novels, history, like books, epos, tragedy, drama, comedy, pantomimes, picture, comics, even, and our conversation. Online, we can see a lot of stories. So in this almost infinite form, endless forms, narrative exists at all times. in all corners of the earth, in all society. And narrative begins with the existence of mankind from the very first history of mankind. So, and now narrative, or sorry, a myth has two meanings. The first is a myth is a story of gods, heroes, and goddesses, like that. That's the traditional meaning of the word myth. In semiotics, another meaning or the second meaning is of a myth is a narrative is a narrative that is not always the case. Is I don't want to say it's untrue story. It's maybe uncontested stories, theories. You can say that based on usually dominant ideologies. Okay, and for example, you can create a myth about making merit, making merit on certain days would bring you uh, what we call more benefits than ordinary days. Uh, that's maybe whiter skin is more attractive than darker skin. I mean that is also a myth. Uh, and there are other myths, uh, and we have to recognize this. Sometimes when we deal with myths, we actually uh, limit our perception of the world. Okay, so we are subject. I don't want we are gullible, easily fooled. We can be fooled by certain narratives or the myth. For example, the myth, the the dualist thinking, and binarist thinking of good, and the opposites of good is evil, black and white, left and right, lawful, unlawful. These binary, what we call concepts, are quite damaging because they somehow limit our ability to actually see things as they are. We are being what we call, I don't want to say mass. We are being mass, like this, by the dualism and binarism and the myths in front of us. But again, after all, we are a cultural product ourselves, so we are still need structure. We still need structure in order to function. Now, there are many binarisms like this one, the binarism of male, female. But as you can see nowadays, gender is not as rigidly defined as gender in the past. We have what we call LGBTQ as well, and binarism of north and south, east and west. Come to think about it, that this is just our view of the world. We actually classify peoples, and then brand them, label them as being from the West, being from the North, in order to define our cultural identity. And I don't want to say it, but this is the prop against the unity of humanity, of human beings. Division. Now we uh, categorize things. That our very ability to make sense of the world through categorization is also imprison us, put us in the confined area. Uh, when remember one principle we talk about uh, the concept of difference. In order to define a word, you need other words to define it. So you kind of excluding thing and build certain kind of boundary in your definition. So this is our, you know, what I would say greatest shortcoming. Maybe the architect that design our logic has set up is this way. I don't know how to resolve this. We have to accept imperfection as well as perfection. As I just mentioned, a myth is a form of narratives, and a myth has two meanings. As I just mentioned, a traditional story and also something untrue, usually found in the narratives of dominant ideologies. Okay. And in semiotics, myth is the most obvious level of signification, but it distorts meaning by validating arbitrary cultural assumption in a way similar to the denotative side. Well, as I just told you, we create a myth by uh, assigning positive qualities to certain people, certain objects or ideas, and exclude or devalue or demote other sides. So we are biased. So both connotation and myths act as cultural codes, according to Barthes, that are interpreted through semiotic analysis. So we can perceive myth as, like I said, a set of cultural codes that can be interpreted and can be deconstructed so that we can see the construction. In order to see the construction, you need to deconstruct. So myths, therefore, are cultural codes that are man-made. Now you may ask, this is coming to the last topic of my lecture, which is on what's wrong with all of those myths. My answer to this is that we need to have myths in order to function, to make sense, to navigate the world at all. We need this kind of myths. Many of the myths, I would say, are in our DNA, but I have no proof. Okay, You don't have to think for it to about it yourself. Is we are born with it. Myths promote social cohesion. For example, national slogan. Okay, every economy, every state has myths, a set of myths. For example, Thailand is the land of smiles. This is also a myth because well, it's not always true. We know that, but nonetheless, as we need to have some establishment institution as a symbol of our cultural group. However, what I'm saying is that myth has pros and cons. For the pros, is promote social cohesion and personal, what we call satisfaction, family thing. And however, myths also create inequalities. There are many examples of the belief system or narratives that actually classify peoples into different classes, and I don't want to mention it here because this is online. And there are also myths that promotes violence and superstition. We can think of many, not only some. Um, but I'm sorry to say that many ideas that we hold on to be relevant, to be important in our life, may be simply a myth, because that's what the best we can do in semiotics. But as I just mentioned, do we need this? We need myths for social cohesion, for personal satisfaction, for us to function in the society, in certain culture. Nevertheless, I will just mention it, but I will give you some myths. Examples: with vaccines are the best answer to COVID-19. Well, maybe this is just a myth. We don't know, but we need to have some kind of hope to live on. Okay? And science itself has limitation too. Another myth about this is political myth: a new charter or a new constitution will make Thailand more cohesive, will unify the country, will make Thailand democracy strong. It's also a myth. We don't know. Uh, Submarines can make Thailand safer and our borders more secure. Submarines. We need submarines for national defense. Uh, uh, we will be more secure. I'm not quite sure about this. Maybe it's just a myth. Maybe it's a true story, but nobody knows. And more defense personnel is good for the country. If you have a lot of, if you have a big army, strong and big army, the people in the country will be happier. Is it true? So we need to question our what we call narratives. So this come to the notion of deconstruction or demystification. So we may not be able to live without myths, to live without subjecting to certain kind of narratives. We need narratives. We need structure. Nonetheless, we need also to develop our capacity to deconstruct or to demystify such narratives. We need metaphors. At the same time, we need to be able to unpack those metaphors, those narratives, those myths. This is important. So the reason we are learning semiotics, we are doing semiotics or semiotic analysis, is for us to understand the construction of a cultural unit or a cultural resource. Such cultural resource can be visual, can be textual, or can be episodic. It can be a narrative or a story. We really need to be able to understand their construction. In other words, we need to be understand somehow the intention of the architect. And why is it important? But because everything I told you, the world is full of myths. There are also myths about sciences. Like if we could find life on other planets, we would have peace. Humans will suddenly love each other. There will be no more war, no more conflicts. There will be human unity, the grand unity of human life. Again, this is also a myth. Maybe it's more than that. So we need to kind of to find the perfect harmony in order to navigate ourselves in the cultural setting. Again, it's also the question of emancipation. As I just mentioned, we need to understand science as being a cultural product. How science are systematized to form codes, and the meaning that created through science can be denotative meaning, connotative meaning, and how science are created, how different narratives are competing for our perception attention, and the recognition that many narratives are actually myths, and in other words, a myth is actually a form of narratives. Therefore, we need to kind of be able to understand the construction of certain narrative. We need to somehow demystify and deconstruct certain semantic structure. In that way, we can have a chance to experience integration or integrative mind with our uh, to break away, to break free from the bondage of attachment through size, to become a truer human being and understand our limitations as human being that still need structure, and also live freely with more purpose in life. And I want to leave you with this quotation. The only thing that really exists is the story you are telling yourself. Actually, if positive thinking is very important, you look at this quote, you need to kind of decide your own destiny. You need to don't let your destiny be imposed upon by people, other people. You have some freedom for yourself. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy. And if you have any question, don't forget to leave your question below.